Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Thank you very much for coming. So in the next 20 minutes or so, what I'm trying to do is to provide an overview, brief overview of how we've used this technology, eye tracking in language learning research, focusing on vocabulary learning, which is one of my areas of expertise. Oops. Yes. So we all agree on the importance of vocabulary for successful communication. We know that second foreign language learners need to acquire huge, very large vocabulary sizes to communicate successfully in a second or foreign language. And we know that from studies that in order to successfully read and understand a range of written and spoken texts, learners need to know around 6,000 to 7,000, 8,000 to 9,000 word families respectively. Now, these figures may be different. Different studies have suggested a slightly different figures, but the point I want to make today is that second and foreign language learners need to acquire very large vocabulary sizes. So we need to know, learners need to know many words and many word families. So an important concern of educators and vocabulary and language learning researchers has been to try to find ways, the most effective ways to support learners in getting these huge learning targets. And when we talk about vocabulary learning, we tend to refer to two main teaching and learning approaches. So we talk about deliberate, more intentional learning, which is the type of learning where learners focus the attention explicitly on the information to be learned, so on a set of words to be learned. So this is the type of learning that happens when learners, for example, are completing vocabulary activities. So explicit vocabulary exercises where there is a clear intention to learn vocabulary. Now, the second approach is incidental learning, which is the type of learning that occurs when learners are using the language for communicative purposes. So the main intention is not really to learn vocabulary, but is to use the language for communicative purposes. So reading, listening. So vocabulary learning in this context happens as a sort of byproduct of the communicative activity. It's not the main intention, but it happens as a sort of byproduct. So when we talk about incidental learning, we're basically referring to learning from reading, listening, reading while listening, viewing, and playing video games. And today, I'm going to provide examples of how the technology, eye tracking, has been used in the context of learning vocabulary from reading and from viewing. So, studies on vocabulary learning from reading and also from viewing, so watching TVs and series, have used this common methodology. So we normally use a pre-test, so a test assessing how much learners know about a set of vocabulary, set of words that then appear in a text or in a video that they're watching. And then after the reading or the viewing, we test knowledge of those words again. So we compare pre and post-test scores, so typical design, and then we assess how much they've learned from being exposed to that new vocabulary in a text or in a video. Now, this is a very useful methodology, and we've learned a lot, and it's very much used nowadays. And it gives us very useful information of what learners actually take from these activities, how much they remember after reading and after viewing. But it doesn't really tell us what happens when learners are actually reading or viewing, so watching a movie, and they actually find words that they don't know. How do they actually engage with this vocabulary? And this is something that we can now do with eye tracking. And again, I'm not sure how much people in the audience know about this. I will start with a brief overview of the technology so that we all know what we are talking about. So eye tracking is based on the idea that the eye is a window to the mind. So it's a technique that has been used for decades in cognitive psychology, and is based on the idea that is considered as an opportunity to look into the mind of the subject. So as I said, used for decades in other areas such as cognitive psychology, psycholinguistics, but only fairly recently used in the context of second language acquisition and second language learning. It's based on two main assumptions. So one is that the amount of time that we spend fixating an item, so an item can be a word or a phrase, it reflects the cognitive effort that it's required to process it. So it's used as a measure of attention and cognitive effort. So it records different types of eye movements. One is saccades, so our rapid movements of the eyes from one point to the next. It also measures fixation, so when the eyes stop, I'll show you an example in a minute. And regression, so this is particular for reading, so it's basically movements back in a text to earlier parts of a text when reading. So for example, if we are reading a sentence like this, the woman saw the man with binoculars, these gray dots would be hypothetical fixations, so points where our eyes stop. Those arrows from A to E would be examples of saccades. And then that final one, F, this arrow back would be an example of a regression. I'll show you a video if it works, hopefully, so that you can see the type of data that we get. So this gray dot that you're going to hopefully see moving is basically someone's gaze, so the eye, the pupil moving while reading a text. So this is what we can see. So bansel there was a pseudo word, so a new word for everyone. So you saw how they went back. There is another one coming, halter. Yeah, they read it, go back, read it again. Where is that? Continue reading the text. So it provides it allows for more natural processing. So there is no need to press a key in the keyboard, for example, as we need to do in other techniques. So it allows for more natural processing, and it provides a very rich record of online processing of different types of stimuli. So we can know exactly where learners are looking at and for how long. And we can have shown an example with a text, but we can record eye movements, basically processing any type of a stimuli that we present on a screen. So it could be images, videos, as I'll talk about in a minute. And for language learning researchers, I think one of the advantages of this technique is that it allows us to explore the connection between attention and processing behavior and gains. So whether basically how learners engage and process vocabulary in this sense, in this case, is related to how much they learn or how well they learn those novel vocabulary. So I'm going to show very briefly an overview of what eye tracking has so far shown about vocabulary learning from reading. So two main questions that researchers have tried to answer in this context, in this area is, as I was saying, how do second language learners process new words when encountering them in context? So what happens when learners are reading a text and they find vocabulary they don't know? Do they spend more time processing it? Do they ignore these words? So how do they deal with these with new words in context? And how does that processing change throughout subsequent exposures? So these are certainly questions that I got interested in when I started working with eye tracking, and I wanted to explore the role of repetition in learning vocabulary and on online processing. So in this early study, we asked participants to read a text containing novel words for everyone. And those words were repeated 8 times throughout the story. So they would see the words 8 times. And we were interested in how much they learned about the words. So we completed some post-tests to see how much they had learned about the new vocabulary. But also we wanted to see how they were processed throughout these 8 repetitions in the story. So what we found in general, and you have here a graph showing the 8th repetition, so 1 to 8, these are the 8 times that participants saw, the learners saw these new words in the story. And we have the total reading time, so the amount, that's the information that we got from the eye movements, the amount of time that people spent processing each of these words. In general, what we found was a very clear pattern where at the beginning, when learners are reading a text and they find words they don't know, they, as expected, spend longer time processing those words, probably trying to figure out what the meaning is from context, but then there is a clear pattern of decrease. So eye tracking allows us to see that actually through repetitions, learners become more familiar with novel vocabulary and the processing becomes easier, faster, and more automatic. What we found as well was by the 8th repetition, so after they had seen the same word 8 times, the reading of this novel vocabulary actually became very similar to words that they were very familiar with. So by the 8th repetition, they were reading novel vocabulary or newly learned vocabulary in a way very similar to words that they already knew. So it's interesting because this pattern that I showed was actually confirmed in following studies that used different types of materials. So in the study that I showed, we used a text that we constructed for the purposes of the study of the research. But then there are other studies that have done with similar aims, but have used different types of materials, graded readers, authentic and modified materials, different types of items, different types of words, even with multi-word units, with collocations, and the pattern seems to be the same. So it shows that it's a pretty robust pattern. At the beginning, learners need more time to engage with novel vocabulary, but then there is a significant decrease with exposure. Words become more familiar to learners. And several studies have shown that longer processing time, so more time processing a novel vocabulary, is related to better learning. And this is important because it supports very important constructs in second language acquisition, such as noticing and attention. So eye tracking research has provided researchers and has allowed us to see this connection between attention and learning. So we know that repetition is key and it leads to a decrease in reading times. But one important question is, how should these repetitions occur? So should we provide these repetitions one after the other, or should we have a longer spacing, longer intervals? And this is a question that has important pedagogical implications. So we're going to provide these repeated encounters to learners. How should we actually provide these encounters? What is most beneficial? And that's another question where eye tracking has been quite instrumental. So we conducted a couple of studies with colleagues from the University of Barcelona, examining the effect of this time distribution on learning and also on processing. And what we found was that, so we basically asked learners to read texts in different conditions. So we had a must condition where participants read the same text 3 times in the same session. So they were exposed to novel vocabulary in this text repeatedly, but in the same session, versus a space condition where they were exposed to the same, but in 3 different sessions. And what we found was that in terms of gains, there were no differences. So they learned the novel vocabulary in a similar way. But then in terms of processing time, what we found was that in time 1, so when learners actually saw novel vocabulary for the first time in a text, they needed more time, but then there was a significant decrease, pretty much what I've shown in the earlier studies. But interestingly, there were no differences between the must and the space condition. So this means that when participants saw these words, whether they saw them 3 times in one session or in 3 different sessions, it didn't really matter for learning or for how they actually process the words. So this kind of speed and fluency and improvement in how fluently these words were read was similar in both conditions. So at least in this study, time distribution, these 2 different schedules were equally effective for the development of the processing of novel vocabulary. So we know that multiple encounters are important in vocabulary learning. We know it's important to think about time distribution. So is there anything else that eye tracking has allowed us to see in the context of learning from reading? Well, we know that incidental vocabulary learning from reading and from other modes really depends on the involvement in processing. So learners need to notice the new vocabulary in the input. Otherwise, it's very unlikely that they will be able to learn them. But it's true that we also know that learners do not always notice the unknown items in the input. So an important question in this area has been, how can we actually help learners to notice linguistic forms in the input? So to make words that they don't know more salient for learners. Different methods have been investigated, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this very common technique, pre-modification of input. So input enhancement techniques such as bolding, underlining, very much used in classroom contexts, where we select words that are potentially difficult for learners and we use different input enhancement techniques to make them more salient. And the idea is that these will attract learners' attention and they will pay more attention to this vocabulary that might be challenging for them. Studies have shown that this supports learning, but again, we didn't, until recently, we didn't really have evidence whether actually these techniques increase attention to the target vocabulary. And this is, again, something where eye tracking has been very useful and instrumental. So we've been able to see whether implementing techniques such as input enhancement, so putting vocabulary words in bold or in red color, whether it actually leads to more attention. And eye tracking studies in this area have shown that that is indeed the case. So with bolding, with putting words in different colors, learners pay more attention to those words, and that's then reflected in better learning. So another method to increase the salience of target vocabulary is this idea of instructional intervention before reading. So this is a very common technique in a classroom context when learners have to deal with a text, including vocabulary that might be challenging. Teachers very often teach that set of vocabulary before the reading activity. And it's this idea that it will support lexical inference from reading, so it will make the reading easier. And there is empirical evidence showing that this is positive for learning, but there have been also conflicting claims around the effectiveness of this pre-reading instruction. So some researchers said, well, it will increase the salience of the vocabulary, which is what we know, but other researchers also said that it might discourage guessing strategies and having a negative effect on learning. And again, this is an area where eye tracking could help, because it could actually show what is the effect of pre-reading instruction on attention to a vocabulary when reading. And this is another area where I conducted a couple of studies with colleagues from University of Nottingham and Vilnius University, where we looked at the effect of pre-reading instruction. So what happens when learners actually are taught a set of vocabulary before reading, and compare that to what happened when they receive no instruction and they just read a text with words that they don't know. So not surprisingly, we found that pre-reading instruction, so teaching the vocabulary before reading, led to the highest gains. But interestingly, we found that there were no, so again, we have a similar graph here with the 8 repetitions of the target items and the total time that they spent processing words. And we found that at the beginning, when they first encounter these words, at first repetition, there were no differences. So it didn't matter whether they had been taught the vocabulary before or not. Participants in the pre-reading instruction or reading-only condition read the items in a similar way. They needed a lot of time to figure out the word and access meaning from context. But then there is a significant pattern of decrease. Reading becomes more fluent. But interestingly, participants in the, so what the eye movement data showed was an advantage of the pre-reading instruction condition after around 7-8 repetitions. So after having seen the word several times, it was the people who received the instruction that had this processing advantage. So they started to read words in a very similar way to a known vocabulary. And that's something that participants in the reading-only condition were not able to do. So basically this shows, and this allowed us to see that pre-reading instruction had this processing advantage that we didn't know of before. So as I was saying, the other area where eye tracking has been really instrumental, and I'll show a couple of examples here, is vocabulary learning from viewing. Okay, so there has been a growing interest in learning from audiovisual input in the last decade, and it's not surprising, as it allows us to maximize exposure to the second language. So it allows learners to get these massive amounts of input that they need to improve their language and vocabulary knowledge as well. So the benefits of learning from audiovisual input are based on important theories in second language learning, such as dual coding or theory of multimedia learning. We have studies showing that it does work in terms of vocabulary learning for both adults and young learners. And this is an area where we've also seen, that gains from viewing can be further enhanced with on-screen text. So a lot of studies on learning from viewing have really focused on what's the role of subtitles and which type of subtitle is best. So we have studies looking at the role of L1 subtitles, L2 subtitles or captions, so in the soundtrack, and subtitles are both in the second language. Bilingual subtitles, so when we have both the L1 and the L2 presented simultaneously, or keyword captioning, so when we have only keywords that are included in the caption. So these are the different types of subtitles that have been investigated in the area in relation to vocabulary learning. Eye tracking, again, has been able to see and to show how learners actually cope and deal and process these different types of subtitles. Something interesting we've seen from this research is that subtitles are read regardless of the type and the mode. People do look at the subtitles, even in cases where they don't know the language of the subtitles. And we see some differences in how subtitles are processed depending on the language and depending on the type. And one type of subtitles that really got my attention, and we conducted a few studies in this area, is the role of bilingual subtitles. So this is a type of subtitle that is very common in certain contexts for certain second language learners, but there is very little evidence of how effective they are. So we looked in a couple of studies to the effectiveness of different subtitle types, focusing on bilingual subtitles and comparing them with other types of subtitles. And we recorded eye movements to see how actually what parts of the subtitle they dealt with, or they actually paid more attention to when learning, and how that when viewing, and how that was related to learning. So in terms of the gains or the benefits of bilingual subtitles, what we found was that they seem to be better than other types of subtitles for comprehension and the acquisition of meaning of the new words, but not so much the acquisition of forms of novel vocabulary. And interestingly, when looking at the eye tracking data, we found that overall participants rely mainly on the L1 line and the L1 translations of words. So when both are presented, people tend to rely more on the first language input. And that's why actually comprehension was better and the meaning of vocabulary was learned better in this condition. But of course, the fact that they pay more attention to the first language meant that the form of the new words were not learned as well as in the other conditions. So, to conclude, with eye tracking in this area, in the context of vocabulary learning, we've been able to have a better idea of how words are processed in these different conditions. We've seen longer reading times on unknown vocabulary during the first encounters, but then we see a rapid increase in this decrease in processing fluency with increased exposures. We've seen that in this case, spacing didn't seem to have, at least in the study that I showed today, it didn't seem to affect these benefits, but of course this is something to look at as it contradicts other current and more recent studies. Textual enhancement, eye tracking has really allowed us to see what are the benefits of textual enhancement and other techniques such as pre-reading instruction. And for viewing, it has allowed us to see that how actually learners process different types of subtitles and what are the actual benefits of subtitling types such as bilingual subtitles. So overall, eye tracking so far in the last decade or so has provided a more comprehensive understanding of the processes involved in learning from different conditions. So the amount of studies that have been conducted using eye tracking in the last 5 to 8 years has increased dramatically to the point where it's become a fairly common technique in SLA and vocabulary learning research. It's provided evidence to support important claims in second language acquisition, but of course, as usual, more research needs to be conducted, looking at more conditions, relationship between attention and gains, and very importantly, most of the research has been conducted with English as a foreign or second language. I think more research needs to be conducted with other languages as well. So I think eye tracking has been able to show loads of things, but of course, eye tracking cannot really, so it's an excellent measure of attention, but it doesn't really show everything about underlying cognitive processes. So I think at the moment there is a call for a better and a triangulation of different data sources. So not only tests and eye movements, as I was showing today, but also including other techniques such as stimulated recalls and interviews, where we ask learners actually how they dealt with new vocabulary from different modalities, and we triangulate all those data sources. And at the moment, that's something that I'm also working on, this co-registration of eye movements and EEG signals. So to combine both eye movements and brain activity to get a better understanding of the underlying cognitive processes of how people learn languages and learn vocabulary from different input modes. And this is certainly the direction where the field is going, and I believe it will provide the most comprehensive understanding of how the cognitive processes people engage in when learning vocabulary from different conditions. And that's everything I wanted to say today. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any questions. Any questions? Oh, there. Please keep questions short.
I will
and answer short.
Yeah. Difficult, but I'll try.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Well done. I have a question about, are you aware of studies where they compared the same participants performing in their second language and in their first language? Because I imagine that people develop certain strategies when looking at text, and they may transfer these habits to looking at their second language test.
Yeah, it's very difficult to keep this short, but I will. Yes, there are studies where people have compared reading in L1 and L2 of the same participants, and of course there are different processing differences and very much related to proficiency as well. Depending on how proficient they are, the differences are. And depending on the language and how similar the languages are. So yes, there is research in that area, and really interesting and clear processing differences depending on a range of factors. Thanks.
Question there.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. But I'm completely from a different discipline, from business and management, if there's ignorance on my part. But you obviously focusing on tracking of eye to detect the learning of vocabulary. I think in your conclusive remark, maybe you mentioned about brain. Could we not consider other parts, sensory parts such as brain, mainly for those people who are maybe partially sighted or with sight problem? So that was my question. Thank you.
Yes. So. That's a huge topic. I'm trying to keep this short, but yeah, absolutely. And there is some interesting research as well being done with, learners with learning difficulties and disabilities. And nowadays there's a very exciting research being conducted with eye tracking and how it can support people with disabilities just to track and use gaze for communication. So where people look, that might be an indication of, just to support communication with people. Yeah, there is, excellent uses of the technique and very exciting research being conducted. So I've talked about, of course, this brief talk, learners without disabilities, but there is very important applications of the technique in this context. So thanks for that question.
Okay, and this will be the last question.
Thanks for a great presentation. I know your focus is on vocabulary, but I would like to know whether you engage with what students focus on more when they read multimodal text, and what the implications of what they focus on would be. Will it be more the visuals? Will it be more the text?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Trying to keep it short. Yes, today I focused on vocabulary, but I've done a lot of research as well on, for example, what happens when learners have text, but they also have images, and they have both simultaneously, and they also have audio. So what happens, that's my general interest in this area, is how do learners cope with these different input modalities that are presented simultaneously. This is another area where eye tracking can be, and it has proven to be very instrumental. We can, for example, when we have images, learners tend to switch more, of course, between the text and the images. When we have the audio, learners make more use of the images because the verbal input is already provided auditorily, so they rely more on the visuals. So yes, these are some of the patterns that we are seeing with eye tracking research in that area. And of course, it has implications for things like comprehension, not only how much vocabulary they learn, but how much they understand. So I think this is the point why I think using eye tracking in this area is really useful, because we can then make a connection between processing patterns, attention, and things like comprehension, grammar learning, vocabulary learning. So yes, there are also studies in this area and showing very interesting patterns and very interesting relations with outcome measures as well. Thank you.